Shabbat Shalom. So Moish calls his mother and asks, "Mom, how you doing?" "Not so good," Mom says. "I'm feeling very weak." "Why, Mom?" Moish asks. Mom says, "Because I haven't eaten in 23 days. "Mom, that's terrible," Moish replies. "Why haven't you eaten in 23 days? Mom answers, "Because I didn't want my mouth to be full of food in case you should call." I'm assuming you're all laughing uproariously, but I have to say it's a lot harder when I can't hear you. So let's try that again. "Mom, why haven't you eaten in 23 days? Mom answers, "Because I didn't want to have my mouth full of food in case you should call." That's better. This week, we begin a new book of the Torah, known in English as Leviticus, which comes ultimately from the Greek to Levitikon, the Levite book, for its emphasis on priestly matters. Indeed, in the Talmud, Leviticus is referred to as Torat Kohanim, the instruction of the priests. But popularly, this book of the Torah has been known since late antiquity by its first word, Vayikra, and God called. I don't know about you, but if I had to pick a theme word for this moment, calling would be a strong candidate. I spent a lot of time calling this week. Calling, being called, being in a call, waiting for a call, waiting in a call for another person to join the call, or for the cam to turn on, or for someone to unmute. Just hit the mute, just tap the little microphone in the, got it, bottom left? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Good. The word Vayikra, as it's written in the Torah scroll, has an unusual feature. If you happen to have a Torah scroll in your house, you can check it yourself. If not, you'll have to take my word for it. But I've written an example. Here, this is what it looks like in a Torah scroll. In every Torah scroll around the world, since at least the Middle Ages, the final letter of Vayikra, the Aleph, is written smaller. It's called Aleph Ze'ira, a small Aleph. Since the Middle Ages, commentators have noticed this small Aleph and associated it with the reduction of the self, since Aleph is the first letter of the word Ani, or Anochi, which means I. Thus, the Aleph Ze'ira of Vayikra is understood as a symbol of humility and letting go of ego. And most commentators assume that it refers to Moshe, especially since Moshe is described elsewhere in the Torah as the most humble person on earth. From this, many beautiful divrei Torah have been written about the need for humility before God, and Moshe as a model for engaging in deep listening and responding to God's call. But there is another possible reading, which is that perhaps this Aleph, Ze'ira, refers not to Moshe's ego, but to God's ego. God, after all, is also an Anochi. The first word of the Ten Commandments is Anochi. Anochi Adonai Elohecha. I am the Lord your God. So if Moshe needed to reduce his Aleph, his ego, in response to God calling him, perhaps it is equally true that God needed to reduce God's self in order to initiate the call in the first place. This is hinted at by the 13th century French mystic Yitzhak ben Yehuda of Sens, who writes, and I quote, "The Holy Blessed One had to contract God's self, tzimtzem atzmo, into the Mishkan, and it was from this contraction that God called to Moshe, after having reduced and contracted the divine presence, as it were. Therefore the word Vayikra is written with a small aleph." In other words, it is actually the one who calls, not just the one who is called, who has to take on the Aleph Ze'ira, the position of reduced ego. Even God, it seems, sometimes has to take a deep breath before picking up the phone. While it might seem intuitive that listening and responding to a call demands tzimtzum, a reduction of ego. For me, the most striking challenge of Vayikra is how the act of calling also demands tzimtzum from the caller. This is noted by Rabbi Shoshana Gelfand in her essay on Vayikra, which she calls the Book of Relationships. She writes, quote, "By first calling to Moses, God creates a situation whereby God's presence has withdrawn inward to create space for Moses in the conversation. Moses can now be a partner rather than a passive recipient. Thus it becomes clear from the very first word that the content of the book is about relationships. God structures the relationship with Moses so that it is a partnership, one that can have true intimacy." According to Rabbi Gelfand, then, naming the book Leviticus disguises its true lesson. It's not only about priestly duties, about sacrifices and temple rituals, but it's about how to be in relationship. And relationships, our Parsha teaches us, depend on this dance of calling and being called. The Talmud comments on this opening verse, Vayikra el Moshe vayidaber, God called to Moshe and spoke to him, and asks, Lama hikdim kri'a ledibur? Why does calling precede speaking? Limda Torah derech eretz, in order to teach us proper ethics. Shelo yomar adam davar lechavero ela im ken korehu, that no one should say anything to another person without calling to them first. The Aleph Ze'ira of Vayikra is a reminder that calling also demands humility. To reach out to another person, to initiate a moment of mutual connection, to ask permission to be in relationship. Calling someone is hard. As a millennial, I know this all too well. What if they don't answer the phone? What if they do answer the phone? What if they don't want to talk to me? And what if they do? Calling opens for us all the possible vulnerability of being rejected and all the possible vulnerability of being heard. Rashi explains our opening verse as follows. L'chol dibrot, u'l'chol amirot, u'l'chol tzivuyim kadma kriya. All speaking and all talking and all commanding is preceded by calling. Kriya lashon chiba, because calling is the language of intimacy. Lashon shemalachei hasharet mishtamshin bo. It is the language that divine servants use, as it is written, v'kara ze el ze. The angels called to one another. Calling is an act of intimacy, and intimacy requires vulnerability. At least that's what my therapist tells me. We have to swallow our pride and reduce our ego to call someone, to reach out unprompted. It requires the strength to say, I'm calling you because I need you, and I'm willing to admit that. I'm ready for you to know that. That's scary, and that's brave. And it's what we need in this time of tzimtzum, this time of contraction and withdrawal. Vayikra is inviting us to act like divine messengers and bravely call out to each other with love and affection. Why is calling each other so hard? Because it means jumping over the impossible gap, the chasm that separates us from others. What the American psychologist William James termed the breach from one mind to another, the greatest breach in nature. Surely silence would be easier than the risks involved in calling to another person, especially when we are already so fearful and withdrawn. It is a natural impulse to want to protect ourselves. But that's thinking with a big aleph. Thinking about the anochi, a short-sighted focus on the self. Short-sighted because what the self really yearns for is not protection, but connection. The Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard warns us against the proverb that one regrets 10 times for having spoken to once for having kept silent. But to have kept silent, Kierkegaard writes, This is the most dangerous of all. The world considers it dangerous to venture by speaking. And why? Because it is possible to lose. Not to venture is prudent. And yet, precisely by not venturing, it is so terribly easy to lose what would be hard to lose by risking, namely, oneself. We are so afraid of rejection, of loss, and of pain, that we miss our chances to open ourselves to intimacy, and in so doing, we lose a piece of ourselves. Kierkegaard teaches that we think that by avoiding the risk of speech, we are safeguarded against embarrassment and shame. If we ask, they might say no, and that would hurt. It is more prudent, we might think, to stay silent. But if we want to be in relationship, and all evidence, from psychotherapy to social anthropology to Danish philosophy to Torah, points to that being the case. If we want to be in true relationship, we must let go of our self-centered fears, contract our alephs, and take the risk of asking and of calling. As Aviva Zornberg writes, the she'elah, the question that breaks the silence, disturbs the world and potentially creates a new one. The space out of which questions emerge tells of separation, separation from God and from other human beings. Bridging this gap, which is stretched, taut with potential relationship, comes language. Language bridges that uncrossable gap between one mind and another to form relationship. And here, in our parsha, God models the way. Vayikra, calling out with a small aleph, taking the risk of being heard. A few years ago, journalist Tim Creeder wrote an essay in the New York Times that contained one of those sentences that is so sublime in its craft, so masterfully and immediately useful, that it is hard to believe that it did not spring from the pen of Shakespeare or Homer, but was written by an essayist and occasional cartoonist from Baltimore in 2013. The essay opens with Creeder's experience learning what his colleagues really think of him from an accidental email. He writes, quote, "Recently I received an email that wasn't meant for me, but was about me. I'd been CC'd by accident. The context is that I had rented a herd of goats for reasons that aren't relevant here, and sent out a mass email with photographs of the goats attached." Actually, to my mind, the reasons for the goat rental are quite relevant, but we'll have to leave it for now. Creeder goes on to describe how intimate relationships mean loving in others, the same interior complexity we take for granted in ourselves, allowing others to really see us and to give them the gift of really being seen, to take the risk of knowing and of being known, calling and being called. He concludes, "Some years ago, a friend of mine had a dream about a strange invention, a staircase you could descend deep underground, in which you heard recordings of all the things anyone had ever said about you, both good and bad. The catch was, you had to pass through all the worst things people had said at the top, before you could get to the highest compliments at the very bottom. There is no way I would ever make it more than 2.5 steps down such a staircase," writes Creeder, "but I understand its terrible logic." And here is that perfectly crafted sentence. If we want the rewards of being loved, we have to submit to the mortifying ordeal of being known. What better way to describe the fear that lurks at the other end of the telephone, or the Zoom call, as it were? The mortifying ordeal of being known. If I call someone, they'll know that I need them. How mortifying. But Creeder is right. If we want someone to respond to our call, we have to call them first. So if you're looking for something to do this week, consider learning from the Holy Blessed One and giving someone a call, to reach out and let them know that you value your relationship with them. Maybe a colleague, a friend, a family member, maybe even your mother. Just don't call her when her mouth's full. Shabbat Shalom.